The morning sun cast long golden rays through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, painting the marble floors with warm light. Prince Alexander, barely 16 years old, walked quietly through the grand corridors that had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. Unlike most teenagers his age, Alexander carried himself with a gentle dignity that seemed to come naturally, though those who knew him best understood it was carefully cultivated through years of watching his parents treat everyone with equal respect. Today was different from the usual royal schedule. The palace was hosting a special event for underprivileged children from the local community centers, and Alexander had been looking forward to this day for weeks. His mother, the Queen, had always taught him that true royalty meant serving others, not being served by them. As he made his way toward the main hall, he could hear the excited chatter of children echoing through the corridors. The royal guards, dressed in their formal uniforms, stood at attention along the pathways. These men had protected the royal family for years, some of them since Alexander was just a small child. They knew him well, watching him grow from a curious boy who asked endless questions about their duties into the thoughtful young man he had become. Captain Morrison, the head of security, had often remarked privately that Prince Alexander possessed something rare among royals of his generation: genuine humility. As Alexander approached the main entrance hall, he noticed a commotion near the service entrance. A small group of children, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, stood clustered together looking confused and slightly frightened. They wore simple clothes that showed signs of careful mending, clean but clearly not new. Their guardian, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, was speaking in hushed, urgent tones to one of the junior guards. The prince slowed his pace, his natural curiosity drawing him closer to understand what was happening. He could see the woman gesturing apologetically, while the guard, Private Davies, stood rigid with his hand raised in a stopping motion. The children pressed closer to their guardian, sensing the tension in the adult conversation. Alexander moved close enough to hear the exchange. The woman was explaining that they had arrived through the wrong entrance, that they were supposed to be part of the community event, but had gotten lost trying to find the proper way in. Her voice carried the weight of someone who felt out of place in such grand surroundings, and she kept apologizing repeatedly for the confusion. Private Davies, following protocol to the letter, was explaining that he couldn't allow them to pass without proper verification and escort. His voice was professional but firm, and while he wasn't being unkind, his adherence to security procedures was creating a barrier that seemed insurmountable to the small group. The children looked up at the tall guard with wide eyes, not understanding why they couldn't continue to where they were supposed to be. Alexander felt something stir in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. He recognized the look in the children's eyes, the same expression he had seen countless times when protocol and procedure created distance between the royal family and the people they were meant to serve. It was a look that said they felt they didn't belong, that perhaps they had made a mistake in coming at all. Without hesitation, Alexander stepped forward. His movement was quiet but confident, and both the guard and the small group turned toward him with surprise. Private Davies immediately straightened further, if that were possible, and began to speak. "Your Highness, I was just explaining the security protocols." Alexander raised his hand gently, not in the commanding gesture that royals were often taught, but in the way someone might signal a friend to pause. "I can see what's happening here," he said, his voice calm and warm. "These are our guests for today's event, aren't they?" The woman nodded quickly, relief evident in her expression. "Yes, Your Highness. We're from the Riverside Community Center. We were told to arrive at 10 o'clock, but I'm afraid we became turned around in the parking area and came in through the wrong door." Alexander smiled, and it was the kind of genuine smile that immediately put people at ease. That happens more often than you might think. These halls can be quite confusing, even for those of us who live here. He turned to address the children directly, lowering himself slightly so he was closer to their eye level. "I'm Alexander. You must be excited about today's activities." One brave little girl with pigtails stepped forward slightly. "Are you really a prince?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. "I am," Alexander replied simply. "And you're really here to have fun today, which I think is much more important right now." The interaction drew the attention of other guards in the vicinity, including Captain Morrison, who began making his way over to assess the situation. Alexander was aware of the approaching footsteps, but his focus remained on the small group before him. "Private Davies," Alexander said, turning back to the guard, "I appreciate your attention to security protocols. They're important for everyone's safety." His words carried no criticism, only acknowledgement of duty being done. "However, I think in this case, I can personally escort our guests to the main hall. Would that satisfy the security requirements?" Davies looked uncertain, clearly weighing his training against the unusual situation of the prince himself offering to solve the problem. "Your Highness, I should really verify with me," came Captain Morrison's voice as he approached the group. The senior guard assessed the situation quickly, his experienced eyes taking in the confused civilians, the uncertain junior guard, and the prince who stood calmly in the middle of it all. Alexander looked up at Captain Morrison with respect. These two had known each other for years, and Morrison had always appreciated the prince's genuine character. "Captain, I was hoping to escort these guests to the main hall myself. They're part of today's community event, and I believe they've simply arrived through an unexpected entrance." Morrison nodded slowly. Protocol was important, but so was the purpose behind it. The purpose was to protect the royal family and their guests, not to create unnecessary barriers. "Of course, Your Highness. I'll have Davies radio ahead to let the event coordinators know the Riverside group has arrived." The relief on the woman's face was immediate and profound. "Thank you so much, Your Highness. The children have been looking forward to this for weeks." Alexander gestured toward the corridor leading to the main hall. "Then we shouldn't keep them waiting any longer. Would you like to walk with me? I can tell you a bit about the palace as we go." As the small group began moving through the corridor, something remarkable happened. Word of the prince's personal escort seemed to spread quietly among the staff and guards they passed. Rather than the usual formal acknowledgments, Alexander noticed that each person they encountered offered warm smiles to the children, small waves, or friendly greetings. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. The palace, which could often feel imposing and formal, began to feel more welcoming. The children, who had started the walk staying close to their guardian and speaking in whispers, gradually began to relax. They started asking questions about the paintings on the walls, the suits of armor they passed, and the crystal chandeliers overhead. Alexander answered each question with patience and genuine enthusiasm. He pointed out details that even regular palace tours might miss, shared stories about historical figures in the portraits, and even revealed which suit of armor used to frighten him when he was their age. His manner was so natural and unassuming that the children soon forgot they were walking with a prince, and simply enjoyed the company of someone who clearly cared about making their experience special. Behind them, Private Davies and Captain Morrison followed at a respectful distance. Morrison observed the interaction with professional interest and personal pride. In his years of service, he had protected royals who demanded deference and those who inspired it. Prince Alexander was clearly in the latter category, and Morrison made a mental note to include this incident in his next report to the Queen, not as a security concern, but as an example of leadership worth recognizing. As they neared the main hall, the sounds of laughter and activity grew louder. Other groups of children were already engaged in various activities, art stations, games, and interactive displays that had been set up specifically for the event. The Riverside group's eyes widened with excitement as they caught glimpses of what awaited them. "This looks amazing," breathed the little girl who had first spoken to Alexander. "It really is," Alexander agreed. "And the best part is, it's all for you and the other children here today. Everyone who helped set this up wanted to make sure you had the most wonderful time possible." The woman from the community center touched Alexander's arm gently. "Your Highness, I can't thank you enough for your kindness. Not just for helping us find our way, but for making the children feel so welcome. This will be a day they remember forever." Alexander felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with royal duty or obligation. This was the feeling his mother had tried to describe when she spoke about the true purpose of their position. The opportunity to use privilege and access to create moments of joy and dignity for others. As Prince Alexander led the Riverside group into the main hall, he was immediately approached by Lady Pemberton, the event coordinator. She was a woman in her early 60s who had organized royal events for over 2 decades, and she prided herself on maintaining perfect schedules and protocols. Her expression showed a mixture of relief and barely concealed stress as she hurried toward them with a clipboard in hand. "Your Highness, thank goodness you're here," she said, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone accustomed to managing complex situations. "We've been looking everywhere for the Riverside group. They were marked as late arrivals, and we were beginning to worry." Alexander gestured to the children and their guardian with a warm smile. "No need to worry, Lady Pemberton. They simply took an alternative route to join us. I think they're ready to dive into all the wonderful activities you've prepared." Lady Pemberton's clipboard remained clutched tightly in her hands as she surveyed the small group. Her years of experience had taught her to categorize people quickly, which guests needed special attention, which groups might require extra supervision, and which situations might present challenges to the smooth running of an event. The Riverside children, with their obviously modest clothing and wide-eyed expressions, fell into what she mentally classified as requiring careful management. "Of course, Your Highness," she replied, though her tone suggested she was already mentally reorganizing her carefully planned schedule. "I'll have one of the junior staff members escort them to the designated area for community groups." Something in her tone, perhaps the subtle emphasis on designated area, caused Alexander to pause. He looked around the main hall, taking in the scene with fresh eyes. The space was large and beautifully decorated, with various activity stations set up throughout. He noticed that there seemed to be an invisible but clear division in how different groups were positioned. Children who were obviously from more affluent backgrounds were clustered near the more elaborate displays and interactive exhibits, while other groups were guided towards simpler activities positioned closer to the walls. The realization struck Alexander like a quiet revelation. Even within an event designed to bring different communities together, the old patterns of social hierarchy were being subtly maintained. It wasn't necessarily intentional cruelty, but rather the automatic preservation of familiar boundaries that adults often created without even realizing it. "Actually, Lady Pemberton," Alexander said, his voice maintaining its respectful tone while carrying a new note of quiet determination, "I was hoping to personally introduce the Riverside group to some of the other children here today. Perhaps we could start at the Central Art Station?" The art station he referred to was the crown jewel of the day's activities, a large interactive mural where children could add their own creative elements to a collaborative masterpiece. It was positioned prominently in the center of the hall and was currently surrounded by children from the most prestigious private schools in the area. Lady Pemberton's eyebrows raised almost imperceptibly. "Your Highness, I'm not sure that particular station is... That is to say, perhaps the Riverside children might be more comfortable starting with activities more suited to..." She paused, clearly struggling to find diplomatic language for her concerns. "More suited to what?" Alexander asked gently, though there was steel beneath the silk in his question. The woman from the Riverside Community Center, who had been listening to this exchange, shifted uncomfortably. She clearly sensed the undercurrents of the conversation, and Alexander could see in her expression the familiar resignation of someone accustomed to being politely redirected away from spaces where she and her charges might not be considered to fit in. It was then that Alexander made a decision that would be talked about in palace circles for months to come. Rather than engaging in further diplomatic discussion with Lady Pemberton, he turned to address all the children in the Riverside group directly. "Would you like to see something really special?" he asked them, his voice filled with genuine excitement. "There's an art project in the center of the hall where everyone can paint part of a huge mural together. I've been looking forward to trying it myself." The children's faces lit up with enthusiasm, and before Lady Pemberton could raise further objections, Alexander was already walking toward the Central Art Station with the Riverside group following eagerly behind him. The other children at the station looked up as the prince approached, and their adult supervisors immediately began adjusting their positions and expressions in the way people do when royalty unexpectedly enters their space. "Good morning, everyone," Alexander said to the gathered children with the same warm tone he had used with the Riverside group. "I hope you don't mind if we join your painting project. I think these artists have some wonderful ideas to add to your mural." The response was immediate and telling. The children from both groups looked at each other with curiosity rather than judgment, their natural openness not yet shaped by adult prejudices. It was the adults who showed discomfort, particularly some of the private school coordinators who had clearly not expected their carefully managed environment to be disrupted by what they perceived as a mixing of social classes. Alexander seemed oblivious to the adult tension as he rolled up his sleeves and picked up a paintbrush. "What do you think this section needs?" he asked a boy from Riverside who was staring at the mural with obvious longing. "I was thinking maybe some trees, but I'm not very good at painting leaves." "I can paint leaves," the boy said quietly, his confidence growing as Alexander handed him a brush and guided him to a spot directly in the center of the mural. "My teacher at school says I'm good at art." "Then you're exactly what this mural needs," Alexander replied with genuine enthusiasm. What happened next was something that even the most experienced royal observers would struggle to describe adequately. As Prince Alexander painted alongside children from all backgrounds, treating each contribution with equal respect and enthusiasm, the artificial barriers in the room began to dissolve. Children naturally began mixing between groups, sharing brushes and ideas, comparing techniques, and simply enjoying the creative process together. The adults, however, remained more resistant to this social blending. Alexander became aware of whispered conversations at the edges of his vision, concerned glances, and the subtle body language of people who felt their carefully maintained social order was being disrupted. He could sense Lady Pemberton approaching from behind, no doubt preparing to suggest a more appropriate activity distribution. It was at this moment that something unexpected happened. A small girl from one of the private schools, her dress clearly expensive and her hair perfectly styled, accidentally knocked over a container of paint. The blue liquid splashed across the floor and onto the simple shoes of Sarah, the little girl with pigtails from the Riverside group. The room seemed to hold its breath. Lady Pemberton moved forward quickly, clearly preparing to manage what she saw as a potential incident. The private school girl's supervisor also stepped forward, her face showing concern about potential complaints or conflicts. But before any adult could intervene, Alexander was already kneeling on the floor with both girls, helping to clean up the spill. "These things happen," he said cheerfully. "I once spilled purple paint all over my mother's favorite carpet during an art lesson. She was more worried about whether I had gotten paint in my hair than about the carpet." The private school girl, tears beginning to form in her eyes, looked up at the prince. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to." Of course you didn't, Alexander replied gently. Accidents are just part of making art, right, Sarah? He turned to include the Riverside girl, whose shoes now had blue paint splattered on them. Sarah, instead of being upset, was examining her shoes with interest. Actually, I think it looks kind of pretty, she said thoughtfully. Like I stepped in a puddle of sky. The simple, poetic response broke the tension completely. The private school girl stopped crying and looked at Sarah with new interest. That's a really nice way to think about it, she said. Alexander smiled as he finished cleaning up the paint. Sarah, would you like to add some sky puddles to our mural? And maybe you could show Emma here how you painted those beautiful leaves. The two girls immediately became absorbed in working together, their different backgrounds forgotten in the shared joy of creation. Around them, other children began to follow their example, naturally gravitating toward collaborative rather than segregated play. It was then that Alexander noticed Captain Morrison watching the scene from across the room. The head of security was speaking quietly into his radio. And Alexander wondered if the unusual mixing of social groups was being reported as some kind of security concern. The thought troubled him more than he expected it to. Standing up from where he had been kneeling, Alexander made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of continuing to work quietly within the system, he decided to address the situation more directly. He walked over to where Lady Pemberton stood with several other adult supervisors, all of whom were watching the children's interactions with varying degrees of concern. Lady Pemberton, Alexander said, his voice carrying a new note of authority that those who knew him recognized as a sign that the prince was transitioning from polite cooperation to quiet leadership. I've been thinking about how we might make this event even more successful. Yes, Your Highness, she replied, though her tone suggested she was bracing herself for complications. I think the children are showing us something important, Alexander continued, gesturing toward the mixed groups who were now fully absorbed in collaborative activities. They're demonstrating that when we remove artificial barriers, everyone benefits. The art is more creative, the conversations are more interesting, and the learning is richer. Several of the private school coordinators exchanged glances, and Alexander could see that his observation was not being received as the innocent comment he was presenting it as. They understood that he was making a point about their attempts to maintain social segregation even within a supposedly inclusive event. Your Highness, one of the coordinators began carefully, while we certainly appreciate the spirit of inclusion, there are practical considerations about different educational backgrounds, behavioral expectations, and... Alexander listened to the carefully worded objections, understanding that beneath the diplomatic language lay deeper concerns about social mixing that made many adults uncomfortable. He realized that this moment represented more than just an art activity gone off script. It was a test of what kind of leader he would choose to become. Prince Alexander looked around the room at the adults who were watching him expectantly, waiting for his response to their concerns about maintaining appropriate social boundaries. He could feel the weight of the moment. This was not just about a children's art activity, but about the kind of leader he would choose to be and the values he would champion. I understand your concerns, Alexander began, his voice calm but carrying a new authority that surprised even himself. But I think we might be overlooking something important. These children aren't just representatives of different schools or backgrounds. They're individuals with unique talents, perspectives, and dreams. He gestured toward the mural where Sarah and Emma were now working together, completely absorbed in their collaborative creation. Look at what they're accomplishing together. Sarah's creativity is inspiring Emma to try new techniques, and Emma's attention to detail is helping Sarah refine her natural artistic instincts. Neither of them would have created something this beautiful working alone. Lady Pemberton shifted her clipboard, clearly struggling with how to respond to the prince's observation without appearing to disagree with royal perspective. Of course, Your Highness, but there are established protocols for these events, considerations about supervision ratios, and expectations from the participating institutions. "What if we created new protocols?" Alexander asked, the question hanging in the air like a gentle challenge. "What if instead of managing differences we celebrated them? What if these events became opportunities to break down barriers rather than politely maintain them?" The suggestion sent a ripple of unease through the adult supervisors. Alexander could see them exchanging glances, each waiting for someone else to voice the objections they all felt. It was then that he noticed something that made him smile. Captain Morrison was approaching the group, and his expression was one of barely concealed pride rather than concern. "Your Highness," Morrison said as he joined the circle, "I wanted to inform you that the Queen has arrived and is observing the event from the balcony overlooking the hall." Alexander looked up and saw his mother standing at the ornate railing above, watching the scene below with keen interest. Even from a distance, he could see that she was taking in not just the children's activities, but the adult interactions and social dynamics playing out across the room. Their eyes met, and she gave him the slightest nod, a gesture that in royal communication conveyed both approval and encouragement to continue. The knowledge that his mother was watching gave Alexander the confidence to make his next move. "Lady Pemberton, I'd like to make a formal request. For the remainder of today's event, I'd like to eliminate the designated areas and allow all children to participate in all activities based purely on their interests rather than their backgrounds." The request was delivered with royal politeness, but everyone understood it was not really a request. The private school coordinators looked increasingly uncomfortable, while the community center supervisor watched with amazement as the prince advocated for her children with such clear determination. "Your Highness," one of the private school representatives began carefully, "our parents have certain expectations about the caliber of experience their children will receive." "And what higher caliber of experience could there be," Alexander interrupted gently, "than learning to appreciate excellence wherever it comes from, than discovering that talent and creativity exist in every community, than developing the confidence that comes from contributing to something larger than themselves?" As if summoned by his words, a commotion near the science demonstration area drew everyone's attention. A boy from one of the community groups had apparently asked a question that stumped the visiting professor who was running the exhibit. Instead of being embarrassed, the professor was calling excitedly for everyone to come see what the boy had discovered. "This young man has identified a flaw in my experiment design that I completely missed," the professor announced to the gathering crowd. "His question about air pressure has just taught me something new about my own research." The boy, Marcus, from the Riverside group, stood beaming as children from all backgrounds gathered around to hear his insight explained. Alexander watched the scene with deep satisfaction, seeing in it the proof of everything he had been trying to articulate to the adults. It was then that something remarkable happened. Captain Morrison, who had been observing the entire interaction, made a gesture that those familiar with royal protocol would recognize as highly significant. Instead of maintaining his usual protective stance close to the prince, he stepped back several paces, creating space for Alexander to move freely among all the children without the implicit barrier that security presence sometimes created. The gesture was subtle but powerful, and it was immediately noticed by the other guards positioned around the room. One by one, they followed Morrison's lead, stepping back from their traditional close protection positions to create a more open, welcoming atmosphere. The change was almost invisible to the children, but the adults immediately understood its significance. "Captain Morrison," Alexander said quietly as he passed near the head of security, "thank you." Morrison nodded with the deep respect of a man who had watched the prince grow from childhood into the leader standing before him now. "Your Highness, some barriers protect and others simply separate. Today, you've shown us the difference." The impact of the guards stepping back rippled through the adult supervisors. If the royal security team was comfortable with this level of social integration and informal interaction, then their own concerns about maintaining strict separation seemed suddenly petty and outdated. Lady Pemberton approached Alexander once more, but this time her expression was different, less anxious, more thoughtful. "Your Highness, perhaps we could revise the afternoon schedule to allow for more integrated activities. If you think that would be appropriate." "I think it would be wonderful," Alexander replied with genuine warmth. "But let's not just revise today's schedule. Let's think about how every event like this could be an opportunity to build bridges rather than maintain walls." As the afternoon progressed, the transformation in the event was remarkable. Children moved freely between activities, forming friendships based on shared interests rather than social background. The art mural became a collaborative masterpiece that told the story of diverse perspectives coming together. The science demonstrations turned into lively discussions where questions came from everywhere and insights emerged from unexpected sources. But perhaps most importantly, the adults began to relax and follow the children's lead. Private school coordinators found themselves impressed by the creativity and intelligence of community center children. Community supervisors watched with pride as their young charges held their own in discussions with peers from more privileged backgrounds. Everyone began to see beyond their preconceptions. Alexander spent the rest of the afternoon moving between groups, not as a prince making royal appearances, but as a facilitator helping children discover their shared interests and complementary abilities. He watched Sarah teach Emma advanced drawing techniques, while Emma helped Sarah organize her creative ideas into a coherent artistic vision. He saw Marcus explain his scientific insights to fascinated classmates from elite schools, while learning from them about laboratory resources he had never imagined accessing. As the event drew to a close, Alexander found himself back at the mural, which had become far more beautiful and complex than anyone had originally envisioned. Children from every background had contributed elements that reflected their unique perspectives and experiences, creating something that none of them could have achieved individually. The woman from the Riverside Community Center approached Alexander as the children reluctantly began preparing to leave. Tears were visible in her eyes as she spoke. "Your Highness, I don't know how to thank you for what you've given these children today. Not just access to wonderful activities, but the experience of being valued, of having their contributions welcomed and celebrated." "They've given me something too," Alexander replied thoughtfully. "They've reminded me why this work matters, why breaking down barriers isn't just nice in theory, but essential in practice." As the various groups began their departures, something beautiful happened that no one had planned or coordinated. Children from different backgrounds began exchanging contact information, making plans to continue friendships that had formed during the day. Parents who had arrived with carefully maintained social boundaries found themselves in genuine conversations with families they would never have met under normal circumstances. Captain Morrison watched the scene with professional satisfaction and personal pride. In his years of protecting royals, he had learned to distinguish between those who wore their titles and those who earned them through their actions. Today, he had watched Prince Alexander earn his in the most fundamental way possible, by using his privilege to lift others rather than separate himself from them. Lady Pemberton approached the prince one final time as the event concluded. "Your Highness, I wanted to apologize for my initial resistance to your suggestions. Today has shown me that my job should be facilitating connections rather than managing separations. I hope you'll allow me to plan future events with this new understanding." Alexander smiled at the veteran event coordinator with genuine respect. "Lady Pemberton, your experience and attention to detail made today's success possible. I'm hoping we can work together to make every event an opportunity for this kind of bridge building. As the last of the guests departed, and the palace began returning to its usual quiet elegance, Alexander reflected on the day's events. He understood that what had happened was about much more than a successful children's event. It was about the choice between leadership that maintains comfortable boundaries and leadership that challenges necessary ones. The Queen appeared at his side as he stood looking at the completed mural, which would remain in the palace as a reminder of the day's lessons. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "Today you showed that true royalty means creating space for others to shine, not demanding that they step aside for you." "I learned that from watching you," Alexander replied. "But today I learned something else. Sometimes the most important leadership happens when you convince others to step back. Not out of deference, but out of trust that everyone can rise to meet higher expectations." As the evening settled over the palace, Alexander understood that this day had marked a turning point in his understanding of his role and his purpose. The silence that had fallen over the palace as he acted with pure kindness was not the silence of disapproval or concern, but the silence of recognition, the moment when everyone present realized they were witnessing leadership that would shape a better future. The royal guards had stepped back, not because they were dismissed or forgotten, but because they recognized that the greatest protection they could offer their prince was the space to become the leader he was meant to be. And in that space, Alexander had discovered that true power lies not in commanding others, but in inspiring them to become their best selves. The day's events would be remembered and retold in palace circles, but their real impact would be measured in the relationships formed, the barriers dissolved, and the understanding that excellence flourishes when it is sought and celebrated everywhere it exists. Prince Alexander had learned that kindness is not a weakness to be managed, but a strength to be wielded with wisdom and courage.